Hi, and welcome to my presentation about the 2006 Ethiopia floods by me, Tovar. I do realize that some of these images look very animated, but I don't mean to disregard any of the tragedy that happened. Also, I apologize for any noise. I do have many dogs and foster dogs, and my family tends to be loud. So, why are floods so common in Ethiopia, right? This is because of its topography, right, surrounding it, and its geographical placement, right? Ethiopia has very diverse terrain with tremendously high elevations, mountain ranges, and highland plateaus, which aid in significant amount of runoff, right? In addition, they experience huge amounts of precipitation from June to September, which makes up approximately 80% of their annual rain. Right? So you can imagine how much rain is coming in those months if it's 80% of the annual rain that they get. Right, so due to the season, rainfall has become a main cause of Ethiopian floods. So it's the rainfall. That's what I really want you to pull away from here. Right? So the 2006 Ethiopian floods were no different. The vast amounts of rainfall and topography create various water courses, aka watersheds, in low elevated areas, which subject them to flooding when large bodies of water, in this case, river basins, overflow and carry sediment along with it, with some other aiding factors like SOMA, but won't discuss just because they're not big contributors. But also the African urbanized cities typically lacked proper drainage systems on the land and poor warning systems, right? Leaving or meaning floods posed a greater threat, right? Because of the poor planning. And this was in around the year 2006, so it should not. There's been improvements, right? But I don't want to spoil it yet. So I kind of wanted to highlight a few things. So right here, you can kind of see the levels of precipitation. So you can see around June, February, right? If you look at August to September, and you look up here, this is kind of the region where you got a lot of precipitation, right? One of its peaks. And then if you look over here, you can see the Omo River and the lake, right? We're not really going to focus on the lake, but I would like you to notice, like, flooding that happened here, especially from the Omo River, right? So the Omo River would flood, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. And this was after the flood, and it submerged the island and also caused some topographic changes. And over here, these are the surrounding rivers and lakes in Ethiopia. We will mainly be talking about the Omo, the Rift, and the Awash. Valleys and river basins is what I mean. So the Omo River floods, right? So the cause of the flood was said to be a monsoon flowing over the Red Sea into the surrounding Rift Valley. But remember, it's mainly due to the seasonal rain, right? So it went into the Rift Valley and rushed through the Ethiopia highlands, which rose the water levels of the Omo River basin, reaching its peak in August. Remember, we talked about August to September was like pretty big amounts of precipitation. And it did the same for the Awash and Blue Nile River, but the main contributor here was the Omo River, right? The flood took place overnight when most were sleeping. It was even said that children were out playing at night, which unfortunately those children, some did get lost. So the flood in Ethiopia had accelerated the winds up to 10 miles per second, right? And the water's level rose the levels of the Nile River, right? Before the flood, there was really high magnitudes of runoff and rainoff. During the flood, there were speeds up to, remember, the 10 meters per second, right? And there was very high floodwaters, right? About 1 to 2 meters of water covering the whole area, especially in Diradawa is what I meant to say. Sorry, I meant to introduce that. It's specifically Diradawa, but this is just a very high impacted area, right? There was other impacted areas, so it should apply the same, right? Since Ethiopia didn't have well-planned draining systems in urbanized cities, their houses were mainly made of wood, grasses, and mud walls, right? Although it only took place in a few hours, and the magnitude and heavier amounts It carried heavy amounts of sediments, and the winds were carried along as well. They were pretty strong, right? And this caused a lot of, you know, damage. And I do have images to explain, so don't worry. So right here is your Omo River, right? You can see areas which are very subjected to flooding, right? And there's the lake in contribution, right? And so this is what it looks like. It starts precipitating. And then this is what your homes look like. The ones made of the mud, the grass, and typically a story high, right? So they weren't necessarily built to withstand such great floods. So this left them very subjected to a lot of damage being done. Right, so let's talk about the sediment. So this is the before the flood, right? This is what kind of the Omo River kind of looked like. And this is after, right? September. You can see the white portions are buildup of sediment towards the end of the Omo River, and you can see this is where most of the sediment clashes. So it goes over here and then it's carried to other parts, right? So let's talk about the human impact. So specifically, the town of Dirdawa was impacted about 17,000 people, right? 256 people, 266, 56 lives were lost, 204 went missing. So there was a lot of people displacement, right? And animals as well. So several villages were destroyed, about 14 of them. There was large amounts of sediment accumulation. Remember, we just talked about that. River channels began to shorten, and there were small overflows, though not very strong, so not much overflow still residing. River water from the flood and other sources of runoff invaded their local wells and boreholes, which was their main access to clean water. Since the runoff tends to be bring harmful chemicals and bacteria, the pathogens from the surface contaminated the water in those wells and boreholes, leaving many children and elderly sick from diarrheal disease and meningitis, right? Also, it was reported that snails that were in the water, which were the animals were drinking, which since it was accessible to them, they would drink the snails. I guess they inhaled them, right? And it would cause internal damage to their organs and killed some of the cattle and other livestock. All right, the way the water quality also impacted was it altered the milk production of cattle, right? So the cattle started to initially produced about 4 liters a day, and it reduced by half to only producing 2 liters a day, just because of the water quality. All the runoff, especially from the flood, that contaminated all their water, right? So those impacted by the flood received temporary shelters and assistance by governments and religious organizations, although shelters were said to be overcrowded and diseases spread very easily here in a shelter, that is. So most people would actually rely on their friends, their neighbors, relatives for shelter, financial assistance, etc., vegetation, milk, and stuff like that. But also on the terms of vegetation, right? Vegetation, milk production, and crops were very negatively impacted, right? From the flood, right? Even farmers were trying to replant their crops, but the soil was so saturated and wet, it wasn't going to be possible, right? So this caused a scarcity of food, right? And the prices raised because of the scarcity, right? It all depends on demand. Well, supply, right? Supply and demand. So right here you can see an image of them trying to recuperate from the flood. Right, you can see all the damage done, really big trees being brought down. It's very unfortunate. So, how has Ethiopia recovered? Or we previously talked about they had somewhat poor planning, right? So currently, what I found, I couldn't find much on like home building design, but it has been reported that dams are being built to withstand higher magnitudes of flood. Around the the Chatu River. I know it's not the Omo River, but I couldn't really find a lot of information on the Omo River basin now. Um, so I kind of talk about some improvements that Ethiopia has taken overall. Right, so the Deche River is having 17-kilometer retention walls on either side of it. Right, they're specifically designed to withstand the raining season. Right, we talked about that heavy rainy season to prevent the overflow. So tree planting is also underway, right, on the surrounding cities in hope to reduce the soil erosion. All right. Programs are also being instituted from to inform locals, right, of how to deal and prepare for disasters such as floods. Some people have been aiding the poor or the people that were impacted, right, or any locals that just need help by paying them with food and money, by helping them. In return, they're helping them with road construction, drain clearance, and land conservation, right? Also, the government instituted studies on technical investigation, hydrology, agronomy, as well as topographic surveys, right, to kind of better design dam sites, right, and reconstruct cities to withstand floods, right? So they're currently also working on two major dams that are carbon resilient, right, and environmentally friendly. With one being built, I think it's about 470 million cubic meters of water. And right here is an image of the Dechu River. Right, it's pretty big, and I believe it's still under construction, so I'm not completely sure. But you can see all this vast amounts of water would could pose a threat, right? And so, in terms of resources, most of these first few are where I got my resources about the causes of the Ethiopia. So if you want to look more about like the climate region and stuff like that. And this one is more talking about some of the human impact and other contributing factors. And this is talking about the magnitude and human impact. And so as this one, I believe this one's talking more about impacted regions such as the Diradawa village. And this is where they're doing preventatives if you want to know more about those. And then most of these down here are rivers. I mean, not rivers. I'm sorry. Are images that I have placed in the PowerPoint. And that is it. And thank you for watching.